The president is dead. April 12, 1945. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who led America through the Great Depression and the Second World War, collapses at his desk in Warm Springs, Georgia. Massive cerebral hemorrhage. Gone in minutes. Across the nation, radios crackle with the news. Factories stop. Women weep in the streets. Soldiers overseas bow their heads. For 12 years, Roosevelt was America's voice. The man who promised a New Deal, the man who would rebuild the world from the ashes of war. Now he's gone. And in his place stands a man Roosevelt considered clueless. Harry S. Truman. Former Thai salesman from Missouri. Former failed businessman. Former dirt farmer. He went into politics late in life, elected to the Senate only 10 years ago. When Roosevelt picked him as vice president, it wasn't for his brilliance. It was electoral math. Truman could deliver Missouri and the border states. That's it. 3 months as vice president. Roosevelt met him in private exactly twice. No briefings about the atomic bomb being built in secret in the New Mexico desert. No details about the deals made with Stalin and Churchill 2 months earlier in Crimea. No explanation of the promises that would trap the world in a 40-year Cold War. Nothing. The front pages scream Truman's own words. Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. When they told me what happened, I felt like the moon, stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. Even decades later, Truman's grandson remembers his grandfather's shock. He was not ready for that at all. He said there must be 1 million men better qualified than him. But it was his job now. So he'd do it. That's who Harry Truman was. Give him a job, he'd finish it, no matter the cost. But this job seemed impossible. Hitler's armies were collapsing, but the war in the Pacific raged on. Japanese kamikazes crashed into American ships daily. And half a world away, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator who'd lost 20 million people defeating the Nazis, was already breaking every promise he'd made. To understand how a shopkeeper from Missouri would face down history's most dangerous dictator, we have to go back 2 months before Roosevelt died, to a palace on the Black Sea, where 3 men sat down to divide the world. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin. For 8 days they negotiated behind closed doors, trading countries like poker chips, making deals that would reshape the map of Europe. And the entire time, Stalin's spies were listening. Hidden microphones in the walls, in the trees, in the gardens, recording every word Roosevelt and Churchill said, every weakness, every compromise. Stalin knew everything. Truman knew nothing. But he'd learn fast. Because in 3 months, the shopkeeper would face the dictator, and the fate of the world would hang in the balance. February 1945. For 6 years, Europe has been one vast battlefield. Millions of men are dead. Cities reduced to rubble, entire nations erased from the map. But now there is certainty. Nazi Germany will be defeated. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich is collapsing. The Red Army pushes from the east. American and British forces from the west. It's only a matter of time. And it is now, as the battles still rage, that peace must be designed. Therefore, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill decide to get together. The meeting takes place in a small resort in the south of the Soviet Union. Here in Crimea, on the shores of the Black Sea, these three giants will together dream up the post-war world. This is one of the greatest conferences of all time. The Yalta Conference. There is a photograph. History's memento of this moment. Three men seated side by side. Roosevelt in the center. Churchill to his left. Stalin to his right. But look closer at their faces. They're tense, guarded, wary. Why? What paths led to this moment? United in war, these allies will show themselves at loggerheads in peace. For 8 days, between the 4th and 11th of February, 1945, the three greats will engage in a merciless struggle dictated by their opposing interests and ideologies. Yalta is the last time they will all meet. Each one of them is at a crucial stage of his own destiny. And this conference will soon plunge the world into a new darkness. February 3rd, 1945. After a 7-hour flight, British and American aircraft, which took off by night, land on the frozen runway of Saki Airport in Crimea. As he steps down from the plane, Winston Churchill is stiff and has a raging fever. But the British Prime Minister puts on a brave face. Even unwell, he is ready to write a new page of history. US President Franklin Roosevelt is also ready, despite his extreme fatigue. The man is dying. He has perhaps 2 months to live, but no one knows this yet. Diplomats and servicemen greet each other on the runway. Many of those present at Yalta keep logs and diaries. Thanks to their revelations, we know exactly what happened during the conference. Their writings tell the stories that the official history doesn't. Stalin has not seen fit to come and greet his guests at Saki. This absence is an early gambit in his power game. Negotiations are well and truly underway. It falls to Molotov, Stalin's faithful right-hand man, to meet Roosevelt and Churchill off the plane. Ravaged by polio, Roosevelt can no longer walk. He sits in his wheelchair. Walking beside him, Churchill seems to be in a position of inferiority. This strange scenario is not lost on Churchill's personal doctor, Lord Moran, who protests in his diary. The Prime Minister walked alongside the President like an Indian attendant accompanying Queen Victoria's phaeton in old age. But this is not the last time that Churchill will appear to be Roosevelt's attendant. The war is not yet over, and the British Empire's glory is already beginning to fade. The USA and the Soviet Union are the century's new giants. Yalta will be Churchill's struggle for survival. Yalta is 150 kilometers from Saki. The journey takes no less than 5 hours because of the poor state of the winding road. A whole new ordeal begins for Roosevelt. His daughter, Anna, who is his traveling companion, describes the scene. He's paralyzed, so even in an automobile, he sat in the back seat with 2 cushions behind him to give some support for his legs, which were useless. And so, it was a very difficult trip. With the war still ongoing across Europe, the road to Yalta is kept under close surveillance. 160 fighter planes patrol the sky. Anna Botiga is startled to observe how the Soviets operate. In her diary, she writes, "All along the road from Saki to Yalta, soldiers were posted every 300 meters. Each time a car passed by, those without rifles saluted us. All of these Russian soldiers, women included, were smart and erect." Through the windows, Roosevelt and Churchill witness a scene of devastation. Crimea was won back from the Germans less than a year ago. Over 20 million Russians lost their lives. 70,000 Soviet towns and villages were destroyed. The USSR is profoundly scarred by the war. And Stalin himself has designed the itinerary so that his guests do not miss a single detail of devastation. This allows Stalin, very skillfully, to lay the burden of guilt on his two counterparts, mainly Roosevelt. The unspoken message: "We have lost many people because you didn't come to help us soon enough." After an interminable 5-hour trip, Roosevelt and Churchill finally reach Yalta in the early evening. Roosevelt is exhausted. His journey started 12 days ago when he crossed the Atlantic by boat before catching a plane from Malta. The American president has covered 8,500 kilometers. Churchill has covered 3,200 kilometers. Stalin's journey by train was a mere 1,500 kilometers. It is as if there is some significance to the number of kilometers. Roosevelt was prepared to make the greatest effort, Stalin the least. The Bay of Yalta has lost none of its charm. In the 19th century, it was a kind of Soviet Riviera, where czars and aristocrats came to spend their holidays. The conference delegates would be put up in palaces that are still intact today. Before negotiations began in February 1945, they were completely refurbished. In anticipation of the conference, the palaces were very quickly refurnished, with things brought from Moscow in great convoys, in order to give them a homely feel. They had been terribly neglected for a very long time. It was Stalin who decided to have the conference at Yalta, and he wanted to ensure that his guests had nothing but good memories. He greets them with opulence, reserving them the two finest villas. Levadia Palace for Roosevelt, where the negotiations took place, and Vorontsov Villa for Churchill. It is a clear night over Yalta. Each of the big three gathers his strength for the coming marathon. February 4th, 1945. Day 1 of the negotiations. Before the debates get underway, Stalin pays a courtesy visit to his guests. He starts with Churchill. The two men have not seen each other since they met in Moscow 4 months ago. They are pleased to see one another and take stock of the military situation. Stalin's reunion with Roosevelt is just as cordial. The Russian and the American share a martini, Roosevelt's guilty pleasure. And there's no lemon. Stalin makes a note of this. The next time, he has a huge lemon tree delivered. This makes quite an impression on the British and the Americans, because a lemon tree in the middle of the war is quite remarkable. They're dazzled. And at the same time, it shows off Stalin's power. Because, in the field, Stalin is in a dominant position. Since the spring, the Soviet steamroller has been on the move, and the Red Army is regaining territory from the Germans. They have liberated Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Poland. The Russians are a mere 80 kilometers from Berlin. The Anglo-American forces, however, have been hampered by a German counterattack and are yet to cross the Rhine. You can certainly say from a military point of view the Soviets are clearly ahead of their Western allies. And that gives them the high ground from a diplomatic perspective. It's time for Stalin's war efforts to pay dividends. Added to this imbalance in the field, there is also an ideological disparity. Churchill and Roosevelt are two capitalists facing a communist. But this is not to say that they will present a united front to Stalin. Far from it. In fact, the two men espouse quite differing ideologies. Roosevelt respects Churchill as an old warhorse who stood alone in Europe and admires this fellow who is still capable of remarkable performances. At the same time, he has a degree of contempt for him because he sees him as an old colonialist throwback, while he himself considers he has modern ideals, such as decolonization of the world. Roosevelt needs Stalin more than he needs Churchill. At this time, the US is fighting a war against Japan in the Pacific. The battles are incredibly violent. The Japanese have no hesitation in using kamikaze suicide jets against their foes rather than surrender. Without help from the Russians, the war could go on and on. Roosevelt also needs Stalin to participate in the future United Nations organization, which he's trying to assemble. Without the USSR, the UN will be just an empty shell. In order to move the project forward, Roosevelt is prepared to jettison Churchill, a long-standing ally, but with nothing to offer. Churchill takes this very badly. For him, it is a disaster to arrive separately in the knowledge that Stalin will fully exploit any divergence between the American and the Britain. The British Prime Minister suspects that Stalin will try to establish communist regimes in all of the countries liberated by the Red Army. And he knows that without Roosevelt's help, he will have no chance of stopping him. But Churchill also has his own agenda. Greece. Greece is a former British protectorate. It is an important strategic asset for the British, as Greece opens the path to the Suez Canal, which gives them access to their colonies. But, for the last 2 years, Greece has been in the throes of a violent civil war. The communists are trying to overthrow the king, control the countryside, and are on the verge of taking power. If Greece were to fall to the communists, the future of the entire British Empire could be at stake. Churchill dreads this terrible scenario. In order to avoid this, he makes the first move and becomes embroiled in perilous bargaining. In October 1944, 4 months before Yalta, the British Prime Minister meets Stalin face to face in Moscow. At the time, Roosevelt is in the midst of a re-election campaign. Churchill uses the opportunity of the American president's absence to forge a secret pact with Stalin over Europe's future. So when we talk about dividing up the world, it wasn't done at Yalta, but when Churchill and Stalin met in Moscow. The document, scribbled on a scrap of paper in Churchill's hand, is annotated by Stalin. Like two grocers, they have mutually agreed their shares of the East European crop. Russia gets 90% of Romania. The Soviets get 75% of Bulgaria. Britain gets 90% of Greece. When he gets to Yalta, Churchill is hoping that Stalin will remember this agreement. In order to ensure the Soviet leader leaves him a free hand in Greece, the British Prime Minister is prepared to hang Poland out to dry. This agreement on percentages is in sharp contrast with the idea of an immovable Churchill. He would never have agreed to compromise on any European zones or spheres of influence. But here he was, trading nations like market goods. Meanwhile, Stalin has his own secret weapons. Before the Yalta Conference even begins, he knows everything that is going on. Preparations for the Yalta Conference lasted several months. At the time, Russian information services were well implanted in England and the USA. Soviet agents were providing exhaustive details of how Churchill and Roosevelt were preparing for the conference. Stalin knew exactly what they were planning to discuss and on which positions they were going to stand firm during negotiations. To ensure they did not miss a thing, the Russian Secret Service had also bugged the palaces. Churchill and Roosevelt knew this. What they didn't realize, a little naively, is that when they went to the park to discuss confidential matters, everything was being picked up by multi-directional microphones, which were everywhere. They were in the trees, the bushes. They captured any conversation in a radius of several meters. Stalin does not treat this information lightly. He does not want to miss a shred. He even insists that his spies personally report back to him everything they've heard. Stalin wanted to know how things were said. He even insisted that dialogues were repeated using the same intonations that Churchill and Roosevelt had used. The cards used in the Yalta poker game are marked. Stalin knows exactly what hands his opponents have. He knows exactly where he's heading, while his allies are feeling their way around in the dark. Negotiations finally begin at 5 p.m. The Livadia Palace ballroom has been prepared for the conference. Everything is ready. Ministers and diplomats talk amongst themselves as they wait for the three great leaders. Churchill is the first to arrive with his daughter, Sarah. The Prime Minister is in good spirits and is wearing a Russian cap in tribute to his host. He feels better after a good night's sleep. His temperature has fallen. Stalin is the next to arrive. In front of the cameras, the two men make a show of their camaraderie. This ritual will be repeated for the next 8 days. Roosevelt is already at the negotiation table, having made a discreet entrance. He has banned cameras from filming his arrivals, deeming them too humiliating. He has to get from that wheelchair into a chair, which is not easy when you are paralyzed from the waist down. Each of the big three has his advisors around him. They will not be negotiating alone. Churchill is accompanied by Anthony Eden, his foreign minister, along with diplomat Alexander Cadogan, an expert on Poland. Roosevelt leans on Harry Hopkins, his friend and right-hand man, the man he trusts more than any other. But also his foreign minister, Edward Stettinius. Stalin also has two main advisors. Vyacheslav Molotov is foreign minister and the diplomat. Ivan Maisky is the other. There are 4 large dossiers on the table. The fate of defeated Germany, that of Poland, the United Nations, and the war against Japan. Stalin's first gambit is a masterstroke. He suggests that Roosevelt preside over the plenary sessions. By being made president, Roosevelt is being ingratiated, but also rendered powerless. He will be constrained to being master of ceremonies, during which time others will be able to plot and negotiate behind his back. This is a very clever ploy on Stalin's part. The first session was just a warm-up, with no significant decisions being made. But the Westerners are clearly aware that it will not be easy to make their voices heard against Stalin. So come the evening, each of them hones his strategy for the next day. Churchill ponders calmly alone, gazing at the portraits of British aristocrats that Stalin has thoughtfully had hung on the walls for his enjoyment. Roosevelt develops his battle plan with Harry Hopkins. Day 2. Churchill is once more first to arrive. Stalin, again, is fashionably late. This time, serious matters will be discussed. The German question is to be debated. What will be Germany's fate once she has lost the war? How will the country be managed? What reparations will be appropriate? The Allies have differing positions on all of these questions. Discussions begin with the issue of Germany's imminent occupation. As early as 1944, the plan was that once conquered, the country would be divided and governed in 3 zones: American, British, and Soviet. But now, Churchill requests a 4th zone for France. He no longer wants to stand alone against these 2 giants, who have something of an axe to grind with imperial powers. He wants an alliance with another colonial power. Stalin responds with theatrical magnanimity. The French didn't really fight much during the war, so we don't see why they deserve an occupation zone. They collaborated. They gave up very quickly in 1940. He pauses for effect. But I'm a reasonable man. All right then. But you can share your own occupation zone with them. The concession costs him nothing, and Stalin cedes quickly. But he takes the opportunity to demand something from his allies in return. He wants the maximum reparations possible from Germany. The Soviet Union is ruined. The Boche must pay. This vengeful attitude worries Roosevelt and Churchill. On this occasion, the 2 Western leaders stand fast. If Germany is pillaged and starved to appease Stalin, how can she be put back on her feet? It will inevitably be funded by us, so ultimately we will be the ones paying Stalin's reparations, which is clearly a bad thing. This refusal causes Stalin to dig his heels in. He's vexed and becomes suspicious. He's angry with his allies and becomes aggressive. Frankly, look me in the eye. Tell me, why do you not want the Soviet Union to be rebuilt? Is there some reason in the back of your Western minds why you would be against the legitimate reconstruction of our country? Why do you want to undermine us? First, defiance, then the bluff. Stalin is about to play his trump card. And for that, he will need the support of his crony, Molotov. The 2 men form a peerless duo and are both masters of the dark arts of diplomacy. Molotov is the bad cop, Mr. Niet. He's the one who isn't any fun and will be immovable on the more difficult issues. And the point where Stalin intervenes is when he smooths the waters, as if he's saying, "You're going too far, you don't have to be so harsh." At this point, a total figure for reparations needs to be added to the German dossier. Nothing has yet been decided by the Soviet delegation, other than a minimum and a maximum figure. In his journal, Russian diplomat Ivan Maysky describes the scene. Molotov, sitting to Stalin's right, leans towards him and asks in a worried tone, "Should I give them a total?" "Yes, give them a total," replies Stalin. "Which one?" 5 or 10. That shaver deed in bleed olds. 10, snaps Stalin. It's a way of demonstrating that discussions are ongoing, that nothing has been finalized, and probably seems more reassuring for their counterparts across the table. 10 billion for the USSR. It's agreed. No one says anything. Stalin assumes that the total has been accepted. The Westerners haven't dared to react, but this decision will have severe consequences later on. Because Germany is incapable of paying such a vast sum, the Soviets will take payment in kind and dismantle Germany's industry. Following this first round of negotiations, each of the big three will retire to his palace to recuperate. As usual, Stalin buries himself in dossiers and prepares for the next day's debates. In Livadia Palace, Roosevelt finds a little peace and serenity with his daughter Anna. For the last few years, she has been his confidant and goes everywhere with her father. She was not only good company in the sense of a daughter, but she was very bright, aware, and informed. She was like an assistant, not paid, very informal, but what we would call in English a right-hand man. 15 kilometers away at the Vorontsov, Churchill is with his daughter Sarah. The young woman is an actress and an auxiliary volunteer in the RAF. Churchill enjoys her cheerful presence at his side. The young women are delighted to be involved, and their fathers are happy to show off their daughters in uniform, showing that the whole family is taking part. And it makes a good impression on the entourage. And they can do those things that not everyone else can. For example, Churchill tends to get up late to work in bed, spends a lot of time in the bath. So you can't send an aide-de-camp to get him out, that would just be impossible. But you can send in his daughter. Most evenings that week, one of the leaders invites the others to supper. This is an occasion for more informal negotiations. The first of these meals takes place at the Livadia. The Americans take care of the service, but the Russians provide the food. And Stalin has made it a point of principle to make it sumptuous. These are 15 to 30-course meals with caviar, cream, all kinds of things. Cream is rationed in Britain. People have virtually forgotten what it is. Meanwhile, the Soviet people are starving to death. But Stalin isn't interested in that. He only cares about showing off his power. This is Georgian and Russian hospitality. I'm your host. I will do anything for you. You only have to ask. Psychologically, this gives him the upper hand. I am both your master and your servant. It's marvelous, both marvelous and menacing. Everything is dependent on Stalin's goodwill. That is one of the defining aspects of Yalta. In order to make sure his guests feel at home and well disposed towards him, Stalin has thought of everything. At supper, the alcohol flows freely. It's a well-known fact that if you want successful negotiations, you want the delegates to be at their ease. So, food and drink have always been part of the means at the hosting power's disposal. This is a game in itself, seeing who can drink the most. By which I mean that alcohol clearly played a part at Yalta. The first supper brought the Allies together. A new sense of trust emerged. Negotiations began in a fresh atmosphere. To allow everyone to recover from these bibulous evenings, the plenary sessions were planned for late afternoon. But Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill's cohorts spend their morning working on preparation for the debates. They ponder the possible compromises for each dossier. It will then be left to the big three to thrash it out. 3 weeks after the Yalta conference ends, the illusion shatters. Stalin rides roughshod over every agreement he made. In Romania, with the Red Army still occupying the country, Stalin organizes a brutal power grab by the communists. King Michael is forced at gunpoint to appoint a communist government. The opposition is arrested. Then elections are rigged. In Poland, the situation is even worse. Every time Roosevelt and Churchill put forward the name of a non-communist minister to join the Lublin government, as agreed at Yalta, Stalin simply declines. No explanation. No discussion. Just no. The hitherto confident Roosevelt becomes anxious. Post-war, Roosevelt became disillusioned. He realized that the Stalin he thought he knew bore little resemblance to the real Stalin. On April 1st, 1945, the American president sends a long telegram to his friend Stalin seeking explanations. I cannot conceal from you the concern with which I view the development of events of mutual interest since our fruitful meeting at Yalta. So far, there has been a discouraging lack of progress made in the carrying out, which the world expects, of the political decisions which we reached at the conference. I frankly cannot understand why the recent events in Romania should not be regarded as falling within the terms of that agreement. But Roosevelt's warnings fall on deaf Soviet ears. Stalin ruthlessly follows through with his plan and keeps installing communist regimes in Eastern Europe. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria. One by one, they fall under Soviet control. April 12, 1945. Warm Springs, Georgia. Franklin Delano Roosevelt collapses at his desk. Massive cerebral hemorrhage. The president dies 11 days after sending his telegram to Stalin. He never sees the full extent of Stalin's betrayal. The nation is in shock. Radios across America crackle with the news. Women weep in the streets. Soldiers overseas bow their heads. The man who led them through depression and war is gone. And now the shopkeeper must inherit the mess. Harry S. Truman stands in the White House, his hand on the Bible, taking the oath of office. He is the 33rd President of the United States. Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now, he tells the press. I don't know whether you've ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me what happened, I felt like the moon, stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. His grandson remembers. He was not ready for that at all. He actually said there must be 1 million men better qualified to do this job than him. But it was his job now, so he'd do it. The task is Herculean. He will have to build the world of tomorrow on solid bases, but Truman has no experience of international politics. In the 3 months he has been vice president, Roosevelt has only met him in private twice. Truman has been told nothing. He doesn't know the complex, ambiguous deals concluded at Yalta. Each of the Allies had played his own hand. Truman was not privy to these discussions. He needs to familiarize himself with all the dossiers. He is pragmatic and hard-working, so he has countless briefings with his advisors. But will his relentless work be enough? Can this small-time tie salesman from Missouri hold his own against the formidable Stalin? Meanwhile, Churchill's mounting alarm grows by the day. 1 month after Truman accedes to the White House, the Allies win the war in Europe. All over the continent, people are jubilant. Outside Buckingham Palace, in London, a human tide greets Winston Churchill. The British Prime Minister is lauded as a hero. But even at this euphoric moment, Churchill looks drawn. The smile on his face looks a little forced. In his memoirs, he writes a haunting question. What could seem so terrible that it could darken such a moment? The problem Churchill has goes by the name of Stalin. Now the war in Europe is won, the British Prime Minister is convinced that Stalin will seize this opportunity to install communist regimes everywhere he can. Already, contrary to the pledges made at Yalta, the Soviet leader has established a communist regime in Romania. In Poland, 6 non-communist ministers have been allowed to join the government, but they have a little less power every day. Stalin wanted all of Europe to become communist. It was an ideology, but also because he had the mindset of an emperor, a dictator with an emperor's mindset. The British Prime Minister tries to warn Truman. But the new American president is not interested. For now, Truman has taken the tack that he will honor the agreements made by Roosevelt. He will not have a word said against his communist ally. Churchill can only wait and hope that Truman will see the Soviet leader's true colors for himself. The opportunity soon arises. July 16th, 1945. Berlin Airport. The US President's plane has just landed. Truman is in Europe for a peace conference. This is his opportunity to meet his allies and make up his own mind about them. Talks are to take place at Potsdam, a few miles from Berlin. In order to get there, Truman has to go through the former capital of the Third Reich. Berlin is nothing more than a land of ruins. A few bone-weary people wander around aimlessly. The scene of desolation upsets Truman and convinces him that he needs to help Germany get back on its feet. That evening, he writes in his diary, "Never have I seen such a sorrowful and depressing sight. We saw old men, old women, and young women carrying what they could of what they had left, to nowhere in particular." The conference begins on the next day, July 17th. Here at Sicilienhof Castle, Truman, Stalin, and Churchill meet for the first and only time. As Truman expected, Churchill seems charming. But his advisors keep telling him that Stalin is not to be trusted. However, the new president quickly sizes up the man with whom he'll have to negotiate. "I can deal with Stalin," Truman writes. He is honest, but cunning as hell. Stalin, on the other hand, has no concerns about Truman, whom he just sees as a small-time shopkeeper from Missouri. Stalin knows very little about Truman because he was a bit-pot player. His spies hadn't really spoken about him, and what they had said led him to believe that he was insignificant and weak and could be made to agree to anything. But Truman is a man who sticks to his guns. For against all expectations, despite his lack of experience, the American president knows how to stand firm. He's in no way cowed by Stalin. A matter of character, certainly. But not only that. Truman feels he's in a strong position. Because he's waiting for a piece of information that could make him the most powerful man on the planet. At that precise moment in the United States, a top-secret event is being prepared. While he's negotiating, the president is keenly anticipating some news. On day 2 of the negotiations, he finally receives a telegram in coded language. Doctor has just returned most enthusiastically and confident that the little boy is as husky as his big brother. The light in his eyes is discernible from here to Highhold, and I could have heard his screams from here to my farm. The little boy in question is the first atomic bomb. For the last 4 years, the planet's finest scientists have been working in the greatest secrecy to develop what could be the ultimate weapon. The operation is codenamed Trinity. The first nuclear test in history is an unqualified success. The explosion is the equivalent of detonating 21 kilotons of TNT. Never before has such destructive power been achieved. A single weapon now has the power to annihilate all of humanity. After hesitating, Truman decides to forewarn Stalin. This is obviously seen as bad news. It means that henceforth, the Soviet Union is in a position of inferiority. Everyone was watching out for Stalin's reaction. And Stalin, who was a good actor, said, "Oh, well, I'm pleased for you, and I hope you'll use it against Japan." But was Stalin really in the dark? Despite the drastic measures taken by the Americans to protect the secrecy of their project, Russian spies have managed to infiltrate the Los Alamos base, where the atomic bomb was being developed. Among them is Klaus Fuchs, a German physicist who has fled the Nazis. But Fuchs, a fervent communist, is also a spy in the pay of the Soviet Union. For the last 2 years, the scientist has been passing on all of the plans for the atomic bomb to the Russians. Thanks to this information, Soviet Union has begun to develop its own nuclear bomb. Despite this, on July 24th, when Stalin finds out the American bomb is ready, he becomes anxious. There is nothing Stalin hates more than feeling vulnerable. He called together his entire Potsdam entourage, and he asked them to tell the scientists and everyone else working on the atomic project that he wanted them all to speed up the creation of the Russian atomic bomb as much as possible. The bomb would become an obsession for Stalin. Until he has his own atomic bomb, the supreme leader will not feel confident facing the Americans. His relationship with Truman is about to become fraught. Potsdam will also be the backdrop for another conflagration. In mid-conference, Churchill leaves the negotiating table to head for London to receive the result of the general election. A passionate Democrat, the British Prime Minister, has thrown his hat in the ring once again. He's acclaimed throughout Britain in the weeks he spends campaigning. But as the day dawns on the morning of the election, he has a feeling of foreboding. "I woke suddenly with a sharp stab of almost physical pain. The power to shape the future would be denied me." Churchill's intuition is correct. And to general amazement, he loses the election. Rather than their war hero, the British people have opted for a new man, the Labour leader Clement Attlee. The day after his triumph, Attlee settles into Churchill's still warm seat. Around the table, there is a general sense that there has been a casting error. Clement Attlee is a man who seems truly insignificant. Attlee used to say he was a sheep in sheep's clothing, one observer quips. Or, an empty car stops outside Downing Street and Attlee gets out of it. A modest man with much to be modest about. And this leaves Stalin puzzled because he was convinced that Churchill had all he needed to be able to rig the election, which in Stalin's eyes is what any politician worth his salt would do. Faced with a lost and awkward Attlee, Stalin takes matters into his own hands. He's the last man standing of Yalta's Big Three. Under Attlee, Great Britain is now on the sidelines. There are only 2 superpowers left in the world: the USA and the USSR. Truman and Stalin meet face to face. Very quickly, the differences between the two men turn sour and become genuinely contentious. 5 days after Potsdam, Truman makes a decision which will have significant consequences. The USA will use its atomic bomb against Japan. This ratchets up the tension with Stalin. August 6, 1945. In the early hours of the morning, the American bomber Enola Gay flies towards the Japanese archipelago. At 8:15 a.m., Little Boy is dropped on Hiroshima. A huge mushroom cloud billows over the city. The temperature on the ground reaches 4,000 degrees. 70,000 people die instantly. The city is nothing more than a wasteland of ash and dust. 3 days later, on August 9th, it's Nagasaki's turn to be bombed. The whole world is in shock. Stalin sees the atomic bomb as provocation. He thinks that Truman is trying to intimidate him. He doesn't understand why America has launched its bombs when, on the 8th of August, as promised, the USSR joined the war against Japan alongside the USA. The way we saw it was that the US was sending a clear message in using the atomic bomb against Japan. The aim was not to achieve a quick victory against the Japanese, but to intimidate the Soviet Union in order to be able to dictate American conditions. Obviously, Truman wanted to end the war as quickly as possible and save American lives. But it is also a clear message to Stalin, because Truman fully intends to let him know that he is now in the driver's seat. From then on, Stalin wants to know how much leeway he will get with Truman and decides to test him. In Yalta, Stalin was promised territory in exchange for joining the war against Japan. Sakhalin Island, the Kuril Islands, Dairen, Port Arthur, and a Manchurian railway line. But now, Stalin demands to be allowed to occupy Hokkaido Island. In a telegram to Truman, Stalin explains, "Russian public opinion would like to see our troops get an occupation zone in part of the archipelago. Anything to the contrary would be seriously offensive. I hope my modest request will be satisfied." He then rethinks and adds in his own hand, "Will meet with no objection." The American president is outraged. His response is unequivocal. No. Period. Grandpa expected people to be straightforward and honest, Truman's grandson recalls. That's how he was. He expected people to be truthful with him, to be upfront. And when he discovered that they weren't, and he discovered that Stalin wasn't, he very quickly got his back up and began to deal with Stalin more roughly, more directly, and more confrontationally. Stalin has also decided to move things forward and press his advantage in Europe. Rigged elections. Coups. Wherever he can, Stalin establishes communist regimes. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria, in turn, all fall into Soviet hands. The rampant Stalinization of Europe worries Truman, but he's still unsure how to approach the situation. Then, a telegram lands on his desk on February 22nd, 1946. It changes everything. Its author is George Kennan, an ordinary diplomat posted in Moscow. Kennan has had time to observe how Stalin operates. He has seen that Stalin wants to take control of Eastern Europe and is convinced that the only way to stop him is to stand firm. In a long telegram to Washington, he describes the Soviet apparatus. At the bottom of Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is a traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. Russians are impervious to the logic of reason and very sensitive to the logic of force. Kennan explains that it's pointless to try and appease Stalin. In any case, he cannot and will not be appeased, because that allows him to justify dictatorship. But on the other hand, we should be firm with Stalin, because he understands how the balance of power works, and that when the West stands firm, he's ready to back down. Kennan's analysis confirms everything that the US president had intuitively foreseen. His change of tack is then drastic. Truman jettisons Roosevelt's former advisors, whom he considers too lenient with regards to the Soviet Union, and appoints some new men. Kennan is soon called to the White House as a special advisor. But Truman is still left with a problem. That of explaining this turnaround to the American public. This will be a delicate operation. In the eyes of America, Stalin is a great ally, the man who helped win the war against Hitler. The press has consistently hailed him as a hero. They've been exposed to 4 years of war propaganda, which has shown Stalin as a friend to all children and the great ally who will help America win the war. The propaganda was successful, and Stalin is very popular in the USA. The American president then has an idea. He will make use of the former British Prime Minister and let him deliver the bad news. Churchill still has considerable prestige, and no one will dare to doubt his word. Also, he would surely be delighted to pay a visit to the States. Since losing the election, he's been in a period of deep depression. Stalin has decided to move things forward and press his advantage in Europe. Rigged elections, coups. Wherever he can, Stalin establishes communist regimes. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria, in turn, all fall into Soviet hands. The rampant Stalinization of Europe worries Truman, but he's still unsure how to approach the situation. The telegram which lands on his desk on February 22, 1946, changes everything. Its author is George Kennan, an ordinary diplomat posted in Moscow. Kennan has had time to observe how Stalin operates. He has seen that Stalin wants to take control of Eastern Europe and is convinced that the only way to stop him is to stand firm. In a long telegram to Washington, he describes the Soviet apparatus. At the bottom of Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is a traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. Russians are impervious to the logic of reason and very sensitive to the logic of force. Kennan explains that it's pointless to try and appease Stalin. In any case, he cannot and will not be appeased, because that allows him to justify dictatorship. But on the other hand, we should be firm with Stalin because he understands how the balance of power works. And that, when the West stands firm, he's ready to back down. Kennan's analysis confirms everything that the US president had intuitively foreseen. His change of tack is then drastic. Truman jettisons Roosevelt's former advisors, whom he considers too lenient with regards to the Soviet Union, and appoints some new men. Kennan is soon called to the White House as a special advisor. Truman is still left with a problem. That of explaining this turnaround to the American public. This will be a delicate operation. As in the eyes of America, Stalin is a great ally, the man who helped win the war against Hitler. The press has consistently hailed him as a hero. They've been exposed to 4 years of war propaganda, which has shown Stalin as a friend to all children and the great ally who will help America win the war. The propaganda was successful, and Stalin is very popular in the USA. The American president then has an idea. He will make use of the former British Prime Minister and let him deliver the bad news. Churchill still has considerable prestige, and no one will dare to doubt his word. Also, he would surely be delighted to pay a visit to the States. Since losing the election, he's been in a period of deep depression. March 5, 1946. Everyone in the small town of Fulton, Missouri, has hung out their flag to welcome the former British leader. It's a beautiful sunny day. Truman welcomes Churchill to his home territory, wreathed in smiles. Truman is quite aware that Churchill is about to drop a bombshell, but does not let on that he knows anything. A few minutes later at Fulton University, Churchill gives a speech that will stun his audience and dismay the whole world. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The Iron Curtain speech provokes an outcry. The Americans are shocked. Good old Uncle Joe? This strategy of Truman's is very clever, in that he lets Churchill make the speech where he mentioned the Iron Curtain because it shows America, and the rest of the world, that this change in America's policy is not just down to Truman or a few isolated advisors, but that as significant a figure as Churchill was thinking the same way as the American president. Soon, Stalin's former admirers in the US start to consider him a dangerous tyrant. In the Soviet Union, the Fulton speech is seen as a stab in the back. Stalin is said to be furious. Intellectuals and those close to the Kremlin stand united against Churchill. Churchill was our country's sworn enemy. He was the leader of the world's most anti-Soviet nation in the West. He spent his whole life trying to put one over on the Soviet Union. Henceforth, European countries will have to nail their colours to either the communist or the capitalist mast. In this race to divide up the world, Stalin has a head start. He's already got his hands on countries in Eastern Europe and is making ground in the West. Communist ministers have already found their way into the French and Italian parliaments. How far will Stalin manage to extend his sphere of influence? This question haunts Truman. He understands full well that in this arm wrestle with Stalin, one thing adds weight to his opponent: poverty. Almost 2 years after the end of World War II, Europe has still not got back on its feet. The old continent is staring into the abyss. Truman is perfectly aware that this deprivation makes a perfect breeding ground for communism. But before he can act, he needs a clear view of the situation. In early 1947, Truman sends Montana Senator Mike Mansfield to Europe with a brief to evaluate the situation. His report is horrifying. In every country visited, there was evidence of malnutrition, tuberculosis, and disease. The greater part of the Italian population is subsisting on a bread ration from 75 to 125 grams a day. Very little in addition is eaten. When he reads the report, a new conviction awakens in Truman. If he does not come to Europe's help, he will leave Stalin a free rein on the continent. Truman then decides on a rescue plan for Europe and entrusts it to Secretary of State General George Marshall. Raw materials, machine tools, tons of equipment make their way across the Atlantic. But behind this facade of generosity, the Marshall Plan is also vital as a tool to relaunch the US economy. it was also a way to bring a new vigor to American trade. Because you can't be rich on your own in the world, you need rich partners too. So, by extension, if the USA, who had profited from the war, could not trade with other countries because those countries couldn't afford to buy anything, then America's wealth would go into decline. The Marshall Plan is also a political stratagem designed to destabilize Stalin because American aid is on offer to all European countries, including those in the East. And of course, the Eastern nations, who are under the protection of the Soviet Union, are also in great need, like Poland and Czechoslovakia, who are both offered the Marshall Plan. But ultimately, the conflict of ideologies wins the day. The Marshall Plan was perceived as an American imperialistic ploy to subjugate Western Europe. This was completely unacceptable to Stalin. Those Eastern European countries tempted by the idea of American aid were soon brought into line. In total, 16 countries, all Western, take part in the Marshall Plan. France, the United Kingdom, and Italy are the greatest beneficiaries. By mid-1947, Churchill's Iron Curtain has become a reality. One city will bear the brunt of this new battle of wills between the West and the Soviet Union. Berlin. The German capital lies at the very heart of the Russian zone of occupation. But the city itself is occupied by 4 Allied powers: the USA, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Between them, they have the task of putting Germany back on its feet, but the Allies are unable to agree on a course of action. The Soviet priority is to get their war reparations. The USSR is broke. As predicted by the peace agreements, the Russians take their compensation in kind and dismantle Germany's industry. Entire factories are dismantled and taken to the Soviet Union to be reassembled. Meanwhile, the Americans rebuilt. As promised in the terms of the Marshall Plan, the Americans gave Germany $16 billion. We, on the other hand, gave nothing, one Soviet diplomat admits. We had nothing. We couldn't compete. In the West, life gradually goes back to normal, while Berlin's eastern sector goes to rack and ruin. The Americans want to go further and introduce sweeping reforms to help revitalize the German economy. But Stalin objects. He wants to maintain the status quo. What Stalin wants is a comparable level of suffering on both sides of Berlin, and that the isolated inhabitants of West Berlin end up falling under the influence of East Germany. This capitalist enclave in the middle of a communist sea is unbearable. In order to get through this impasse, the Western powers see only one solution: to merge their occupation zones. This will, without a doubt, infuriate Stalin. But to what extent? Could Stalin start a war? Before proceeding, the West needs information. And there's only one way to get it: espionage. Unfortunately, in these early days of the Cold War, the American secret services are to all intents and purposes non-existent. Literally, it's worth noting that during World War II, in 1942, the Roosevelt administration created the OSS Information Service, but it was no longer active after the war ended in 1945. So, between 1945 and 1947, the United States had no intelligence services as such. Therefore, in the summer of 1947, Truman decides to found a new intelligence agency which will soon be known the world over: the CIA. Former Admiral Henry Hillenkoetter is named as its head he has the difficult task of recruiting and training spies in a very short space of time. The problem is that he will need to find Russian-speaking spies. And other than the Russians themselves, not many people speak Russian. For this former British Secret Service operative, this was a major hindrance. The problem was, how far could you trust someone who was Russian-born with big secrets, because you could never guarantee that they weren't actually on the other side working for the Russians. Hillenkoetter wastes no time. Pragmatically, he realizes that it is among recent enemies that he will find his spies. Reinhard Gehlen, a former Nazi and the Wehrmacht's head of intelligence in the East, is recycled by the CIA. Gehlen knows the communist world extremely well. He becomes the brains behind American espionage in Germany. He helps recruit hundreds of former Nazis to the CIA. The Americans have no qualms about this. The only thing that matters to Truman is blocking Stalin's way. The logistics have changed. In the Cold War, the enemy wasn't Germany, but the Soviet Union. So, ultimately, why not make use of people who are fervently anti-communist? And obviously, those former Nazis hated communists with a passion. So why not? At this point, we're in the middle of genuine realpolitik. The CIA's opponents, Russia's GRU and KGB, are also very active. But they have a considerable head start, as their intelligence services have existed since the First World War. Berlin will become the world's espionage capital. In the street, the civil service, in the armed forces, there are spies everywhere. All of them, regardless of which side they're on, have the same objective: to decipher their opponent's plans and to get one step ahead of them. Espionage was almost certainly a new style of warfare because you needed no guns, and it penetrated right into the center of the other side's worldview. As Truman has requested, Gehlen and his men try to discover what Stalin's reaction would be if the West were to bring all of their zones of occupation together as one. In the late spring of 1948, the German spies think they may finally have the answer. On June 9th, a telegram from Hillenkoetter warns Truman. According to the head of the CIA, if the West were to bring all of their zones of occupation together as one, Stalin's reaction would be this. The USSR may be expected to continue its hindrance of Western powers in Berlin and elsewhere in Germany by any means short of military force. This is the green light the Allies were waiting for. 4 days after Hillenkoetter's telegram, the Americans, British, and French create a new currency for their zone: the Deutschmark. Stalin sees this currency as a symbol of capitalism and a provocation. He has to react. As the German spies had predicted, the Soviet leader then decides on economic retaliation. By mid-1947, Churchill's Iron Curtain has become a reality. One city will bear the brunt of this new battle of wills between the West and the Soviet Union: Berlin. The German capital lies at the very heart of the Russian zone of occupation. But the city itself is occupied by 4 Allied powers: the USA, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Between them, they have the task of putting Germany back on its feet. But the Allies are unable to agree on a course of action. The Soviet priority is to get their war reparations. The USSR is broke, devastated, 20 million dead, 70,000 towns and villages destroyed. As predicted by the peace agreements, the Russians take their compensation in kind and dismantle Germany's industry. Entire factories are dismantled piece by piece. Machinery loaded onto trains, taken to the Soviet Union to be reassembled. A systematic extraction of German industrial capacity. Meanwhile, the Americans rebuilt. As promised in the terms of the Marshall Plan, the Americans gave Germany $16 billion. We, on the other hand, gave nothing, one Soviet diplomat later admits. We had nothing. We couldn't compete. The contrast is visible street by street, block by block. In the West, life gradually goes back to normal. Shops reopen. Cafes fill with customers. Children play in rebuilt parks. The sound of construction echoes through the streets. Berlin's eastern sector, meanwhile, goes to rack and ruin. Buildings remain pockmarked with bullet holes. Rubble sits uncollected. Food is scarce. Hope is scarcer. Same city, two different worlds. The Americans want to go further and introduce sweeping reforms to help revitalize the German economy. A new currency, free market reforms, democratic institutions. But Stalin objects. He wants to maintain the status quo. What Stalin wants is a comparable level of suffering on both sides of Berlin. He wants the isolated inhabitants of West Berlin to see their prosperity fade, to grow desperate, to fall under the influence of East Germany. This capitalist enclave in the middle of a communist sea is unbearable to him. It must be eliminated. In order to get through this impasse, the Western powers see only one solution: to merge their occupation zones. Create a unified West Germany. Introduce the new currency. Move forward without Soviet approval. This will, without a doubt, infuriate Stalin. But to what extent? Will he accept it grudgingly? Will he retaliate economically? Or could Stalin start a war? Before proceeding, the West needs information. They need to know Stalin's intentions. They need to predict his response. And there's only one way to get that information: espionage. Unfortunately, in these early days of the Cold War, the American secret services are to all intents and purposes non-existent. Literally. During World War II, in 1942, the Roosevelt administration created the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. But it was disbanded after the war ended in 1945. Between 1945 and 1947, the United States had no intelligence services as such. None. While Stalin's GRU and KGB had been operating since the First World War, decades of experience, networks across Europe, agents in every major city, America was flying blind. Therefore, in the summer of 1947, Truman decides to found a new intelligence agency, which will soon be known the world over: the CIA. Former Admiral Henry Hillenkoetter is named as its head. He has the difficult task of recruiting and training spies in a very short space of time. The problem is that he will need to find Russian-speaking spies, agents who understand Soviet culture, who know how the communist system works, who can operate in Eastern Europe? And other than the Russians themselves, not many people speak Russian. For one former British Secret Service operative, this was a major hindrance. The problem was, how far could you trust someone who was Russian-born with big secrets? Because you could never guarantee that they weren't actually on the other side working for the Russians. It's a dilemma. They need Russian speakers. But Russian speakers might be double agents. How do you build an intelligence service when you can't trust your own spies? Hillenkoetter wastes no time. Pragmatically, he realizes that it is among recent enemies that he will find his spies. The Nazis. Reinhard Gehlen, a former Nazi and the Wehrmacht's head of intelligence in the East, is recycled by the CIA. Gehlen is perfect for the job. He spent the entire war studying the Soviet Union. He knows Stalin's military. He knows the Communist Party structure. He knows which officials can be bribed, which can be blackmailed, which are true believers. He knows the communist world extremely well. And he hates it with a passion. Gehlen becomes the brains behind American espionage in Germany. He helps recruit hundreds of former Nazis to the CIA, SS officers, Gestapo interrogators, Wehrmacht intelligence operatives, men with blood on their hands now working for American intelligence. The Americans have no qualms about this. The moral calculations have changed. The only thing that matters to Truman is blocking Stalin's way. The logistics have changed, one CIA officer explains. In the Cold War, the enemy wasn't Germany, but the Soviet Union. So, ultimately, why not make use of people who are fervently anti-communist? And obviously those former Nazis hated communists with a passion. So why not? At this point, we're in the middle of genuine realpolitik. Realpolitik indeed. Yesterday's war criminals become today's intelligence assets. The CIA's opponents, Russia's GRU and KGB, are also very active. But they have a considerable head start. Their intelligence services have existed since the First World War. Decades of experience, thousands of trained agents, networks that span the globe. Berlin becomes the world's espionage capital. In the streets, there are spies. In the civil service, there are spies. In the armed forces, there are spies. East German secretaries passing documents to the West. West German officials feeding information to the East. Double agents. Triple agents. Everyone watching everyone. A city of shadows. All of them, regardless of which side they're on, have the same objective: to decipher their opponent's plans and to get one step ahead of them. Espionage was almost certainly a new style of warfare. You needed no guns, no tanks, no bombs, just information. And it penetrated right into the center of the other side's worldview. Knowledge is power. And in Berlin, knowledge could prevent World War III. As Truman has requested, Gehlen and his men try to discover what Stalin's reaction would be if the West were to bring all of their zones of occupation together as one. If the Western powers merge their zones, introduce the Deutschmark, create a unified West Germany, what will Stalin do? Will he invade? Will he blockade? Will he accept it? The German spies work their networks, bribing Soviet officials, intercepting communications, analyzing troop movements, piecing together Stalin's intentions from 1,000 fragments of information. In the late spring of 1948, they think they may finally have the answer. On June 9th, a telegram from Hillenkoetter lands on Truman's desk. According to the head of the CIA, if the West were to bring all of their zones of occupation together as one, Stalin's reaction would be this: the USSR may be expected to continue its hindrance of Western powers in Berlin and elsewhere in Germany by any means short of military force. Any means short of military force. He won't invade, but he will make life difficult. This is the green light the Allies were waiting for. 4 days after Hillenkoetter's telegram, the Americans, British, and French make their move. They create a new currency for their zone: the Deutschmark, a symbol of capitalism, a symbol of Western unity, a symbol that Germany's future lies with the West, not the East. Stalin sees this as a provocation, an insult, a challenge to Soviet power. He has to react. As the German spies had predicted, the Soviet leader decides on economic retaliation. Not military force, but something almost as devastating. On June 24, 1948, Stalin makes his move. He cuts off all supply routes to West Berlin. The roads which link West Germany to West Berlin blocked. The railways closed. The canals shut down. 2.5 million inhabitants of Berlin are trapped. West Berlin is an island, surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory, with no food coming in, no coal, no supplies of any kind. Without help, they will be unable to survive for long. Weeks, perhaps. A month at most. In Washington, some of Truman's advisors urge him to respond with force. Send in tanks. Break through the Soviet roadblocks. Show Stalin that America won't be intimidated. But the US president decides on another option. Something unprecedented. Something impossible. To replenish the city's provisions from the air. He didn't want open warfare between the US and the Soviets, Truman's grandson recalls. That was the last thing he wanted. But he also didn't want to appear weak, like we were going to do nothing. Because if you let the Soviets get away with closing off Berlin, then they take something else. And pretty soon, they've taken everything. I don't think that the idea for the airlift was his originally, but he agreed to it because it made sense. 4 days after the blockade starts, huge British and American cargo planes fly over Berlin. Within their bellies, tons of food, goods, and the famous care packages. Assembled by the American NGO CARE, these parcels contain everything the Berliners need to survive. Bacon, margarine, powdered eggs, chocolate, coffee, sugar. The taste of America delivered from the sky. What Stalin hadn't accounted for at all was that the Americans, the English, and the French together had the wherewithal to keep West Berlin supplied for 11 months, to the tune of 6,000 tons a day. 6,000 tons. Every single day. For 11 months. Every day, a cargo plane lands on one of Berlin's 3 aerodromes every 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Day and night. Rain or shine. Fog, snow, darkness. The planes keep coming. For a year, Berlin citizens live their lives to the rhythm of the aircraft flying back and forth over their heads. The constant drone of engines becomes the soundtrack of their existence. But despite American aid, daily life remains difficult, brutal, a constant struggle for survival. In order to survive, everyone does whatever they can. Sours start appearing in the heart of the city. Soon, vegetables start growing through the tarmac. Parks become gardens. Bomb craters are turned into potato fields. Every available space is cultivated. They also show themselves resourceful where heating is concerned. The Americans are not sending enough coal, so Berliners find wood wherever it is available. Trees are uprooted systematically. Not one bench in the city has any slats left. Furniture is broken up for fuel. Wooden door frames disappear overnight. The winters are brutally cold, and people burn whatever they can find to stay warm. At the markets, people trade with anything they have. Coats for bread, bags for coal, shoes for vegetables. Family heirlooms exchanged for survival. Wedding rings traded for a week's worth of food. Berliners want for everything, but they survive. Their resilience becomes legendary, a symbol of resistance against Soviet pressure. The world watches in admiration. The Americans, too, are determined to stand fast, whatever the cost. Pilots fly around the clock. Maintenance crews work triple shifts. No days off. No breaks. The mission: keep Berlin alive. Some pilots fly so many missions they lose track of the days. They land, unload, refuel, take off again. Land, unload, refuel, take off. An endless cycle. And as predicted by Galen, Stalin does not give the order to shoot down the American planes. He was unprepared to go to war because the Americans had the atomic bomb. The Soviet Union would not have been able to endure another war when 20 million Russians died during World War II. The nuclear deterrent works. Stalin is boxed in by atomic reality. He can't escalate without risking annihilation. He can't shoot down American planes without starting World War III. But he can't back down without losing face. So, the blockade continues. Month after month. Through summer heat and winter snow. Through autumn rains and spring thaws. But it's becoming clear he's losing. The airlift is working. Berlin is surviving. And every day the blockade continues. Stalin looks weaker. Realizing that he had lost the political arm wrestle, Stalin lifts the blockade on May 12, 1949. All over West Berlin, people pour into the streets. They rejoice. They dance. They cry tears of relief. Strangers embrace. Church bells ring across the city. The airlift has succeeded. For the communist leader, this is a humiliating defeat. This small-time shopkeeper from Missouri has got the upper hand over the most feared man on the planet. Stalin's reputation is damaged. His aura of invincibility shattered. In his memoirs, Truman can barely hide his delight. He knows that he has scored a crucial point in his battle against Stalin. The blockade had sharply turned them against communism. Germany, which had been waiting passively to see where it should cast its lot for the future, was veering towards the cause of the Western nations. This was the exact opposite of what Stalin wanted, which was to sow discord between the Allies. It actually sealed reconciliation and friendship between the German and American people. They formed a close bond and were responsible for ensuring the survival of West Berlin. The final blow comes 15 days after the blockade is lifted. On May 23, 1949, the Western powers create the Federal Republic of Germany. West Germany is officially born, capitalist, democratic, allied with the West. The Soviet Union responds on October 7th by founding the Democratic Republic of Germany. East Germany, a communist state under Soviet control. The Allies of yesteryear are now officially enemies. Germany is divided. It will remain divided for the next 40 years. At the White House, Kennan is terrified. He is far-sighted and writes a warning. All in all, our policy on the continent takes us along a street to which there are only three outlets: a Russian collapse, disintegration of our own position, or a terrible war. The threat of a terrible war hangs a little more heavily on the world every day. Stalin has still not recovered from the blockade debacle. He wants to regain the upper hand, and his efforts will eventually allow him to turn the tables once more. At the White House, Kennan is terrified. He is far-sighted and writes a warning that will haunt American policymakers for years. All in all, our policy on the continent takes us along a street to which there are only three outlets: a Russian collapse, disintegration of our own position, or a terrible war. A Russian collapse, disintegration of our own position, or a terrible war. The threat of that terrible war hangs a little more heavily on the world every day. Stalin has still not recovered from the blockade debacle. The humiliation burns. The shopkeeper from Missouri has embarrassed him in front of the entire world. He wants to regain the upper hand, and his efforts will eventually allow him to turn the tables once more. To the horror of the Western powers, on August 29, 1949, the Russians detonate an atomic bomb in Kazakhstan. The test is successful. The mushroom cloud rises over the desert. The Soviet Union has joined the atomic age. The information provided by Klaus Fuchs and his comrades, who infiltrated Los Alamos, has finally borne fruit. The Soviet intelligence services helped us to accelerate the creation of a Soviet atomic bomb, one Russian scientist later testifies. And they allowed us to save a lot of resources. Our scientists believe that the information provided by our intelligence services enabled us to reduce the development time for the bomb from 10 to 5 years. 10 years reduced to 5. Half the time. Thanks to espionage, the Soviets have leapfrogged ahead. This comes as a great shock to Truman. American intelligence had predicted the Soviets wouldn't have a bomb until the mid-1950s at the earliest. They were wrong by years. He could never have imagined that the Soviets, crippled by war, devastated economically, could develop a nuclear weapon so quickly. But they did. Stalin feels empowered again. The confidence returns. The Soviet Union is once more the equal of the United States. The nuclear balance is restored. The world teeters on the brink of terror. Two superpowers, both with atomic weapons, both capable of destroying cities in an instant, both locked in ideological conflict, with no room for compromise. The French philosopher Raymond Aron summed up this Cold War perfectly when he said, "War is impossible. Peace is improbable. War is impossible because it would be nuclear. Any direct conflict between the superpowers would escalate to atomic warfare. And atomic warfare means the end of civilization. Peace is improbable because the ideologies are incompatible. Capitalism versus communism. Democracy versus dictatorship. Freedom versus control. There can be no middle ground. So what emerges is something new. Something the world has never seen before. A Cold War. Conflicts are not long in breaking out, but they will remain localized and be fought by proxy. Because neither American nor Soviet blood should ever be spilt in direct combat. That would cause widespread chaos. That would risk nuclear annihilation. So instead, they will fight through others. Korean soldiers, Vietnamese guerrillas, Afghan rebels, proxy armies killing each other while the superpowers watch from the sidelines. The first of these post-war conflicts to erupt is in a small country that few Russians or Americans would be able to identify on a map of the world. Korea. Since 1945, Korea, which formerly belonged to Japan, has been occupied on both sides of the 38th parallel. To the south, by the Americans. To the north, by the Soviets. The division was supposed to be temporary, just until Korea could be reunified under a single government. But temporary divisions have a way of becoming permanent. Since then, North Korea's communist leader Kim Il-sung has sought to reunite his country by force. He has on several occasions asked Stalin for help, for permission to invade, for weapons and support. But the Soviet leader has always refused. Too risky, too dangerous. The Americans are too close. Not worth the confrontation. However, on January 12, 1950, the Supreme Leader changes his mind. And it is all because of a tiny little sentence uttered by Dean Acheson, the American Secretary of State. That day, in his speech on America's military ambitions, Acheson outlines the US defensive perimeter in Asia. This defensive perimeter runs along the Aleutians, then to Japan, then to the Ryukyus and the Philippines. He forgot about Korea. The worst mistake he could have made. There was Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, everything you like, except Korea, one historian notes. It wasn't clever, which is surprising for someone as experienced as Acheson. But he made a big blunder. Stalin took this as an encouraging sign that the Americans had softened again. If Korea isn't part of their defensive perimeter, then they won't fight for it. Kim Il-sung can invade without American interference. Stalin then gives Kim Il-sung a green light to spring into action. At 4 a.m. on June 25, 1950, North Korean forces cross the 38th parallel. Tanks roll south. Artillery pounds South Korean positions. Infantry advances in massive waves. The invasion begins. The news is immediately broken to Truman, who is spending the weekend in his home in Missouri. A phone call in the middle of the night. The president listens, his face growing grim. The American president does not hesitate for a moment. Force must be met with force. His memoirs recall, if this was to go unchallenged, it would mean a Third World War, just as similar incidents had brought about the Second World War. He remembers the lessons of the 1930s. When Hitler invaded the Rhineland, the world did nothing. When he took Austria, the world did nothing. When he seized Czechoslovakia, the world appeased him. And appeasement led to World War II. This time will be different. This time, aggression will be met with resistance. The problem is that the Americans were not prepared for an attack on Korea. They have virtually no troops there. Just a few hundred military advisors. The North Koreans make ground with alarming ease. They seize Seoul in less than a week. The South Korean army collapses. Refugees flood south in panic. Truman is deeply concerned. How will it all end? Where will the line be drawn? He writes to his wife, "I hope we can contain it and not have to order our terrible weapon turned loose." The terrible weapon. The atomic bomb. Always there in the background. The ultimate option. Truman will not need to use the atomic bomb, as he has another secret weapon in the form of a man. General Douglas MacArthur. The great hero of the war in the Pacific is in charge of the occupation of Japan. He knows Asia very well and is a peerless tactician. Brilliant, egotistical, and utterly confident in his own genius. In just a few months, he succeeds in regaining the advantage over the communists. His daring amphibious landing at Incheon cuts the North Korean army in two. Seoul is recaptured. The tide turns. By November 1950, the Americans have invaded almost all of North Korea and are close to the Chinese border. Victory seems within reach. Korea will be reunified under a democratic government. Communism will be pushed back. But the Cold War is suddenly looking likely to become very hot. Because neighboring China became communist in 1949, and Mao Zedong is not about to let American troops reach his border. Mao sends 500,000 Chinese volunteers to help his North Korean brethren. 500,000. A human wave. They pour across the border in massive numbers. The Americans are caught completely off guard. Here again, you see the prudence of Mao in this conflict, one historian observes, in that he doesn't want China to be seen intervening as a state. So he uses this stratagem of Chinese volunteers to intervene surreptitiously. There is certainly an empirical rather than theoretical mastery of the Cold War. Everyone makes their move, but does so in a controlled way to ensure that the Cold War doesn't become a general, global, and nuclear war. Volunteers. not official Chinese troops. A legal fiction that prevents direct war between China and America. For Truman, these months of intense tension are psychologically exhausting. Every day brings new crises. Every decision could spark World War III. In his journal, he writes, "It is hell to be the president of the most powerful nation on earth. I would rather be the leader of my village." The American president only ever refers to the White House as the White Prison. The Korean conflict becomes a war of attrition. Neither side can win. Neither side will surrender. Thousands die for miles of frozen ground. The war drags on. Month after month. Year after year. But it is a completely unexpected event which brings the era to an end. Stalin disappears. March 1st, 1953. Kuntsevo Dacha, near Moscow. This is where Stalin now lives as a recluse. The man who struck fear in the hearts of the world has locked himself away in a cage of delusional paranoia. He trusts no one. His own doctors have been arrested. His closest advisors walk on eggshells. Anyone could be an enemy. Anyone could be a traitor. He fears he's going to be assassinated. When Stalin goes to bed that night, he's had a lot to drink. Vodka with his inner circle. Hours of drinking and paranoid rambling. During the night, he suffers a cerebral hemorrhage. A massive stroke. He collapses alone in his room. For 10 hours, as he lies dying, no one dares to open his door. Stalin had given strict orders never to be disturbed. His guards are too afraid of the possible reprisals. What if they wake him and he's angry? What if they interrupt his sleep and he has them shot? So they wait. And Stalin dies alone on the floor of his bedroom. He died alone, and all those who could have helped him, such as his doctor, well, he was imprisoned, one historian notes. He could have made a recovery, but when his cronies arrived, like Khrushchev, Beria, Malenkov, they didn't do anything in case it's held against them. So doctors were called, but those doctors were scared. They didn't even dare make a diagnosis, because the KGB behind them is saying, "Be careful what you write and what you discover, comrade." Even in death, Stalin inspires terror. After 4 days of death throes and no adequate treatment, Joseph Stalin dies on March 5th, 1953. He is 74 years old. He has ruled the Soviet Union with absolute power for 29 years. His word was law. His whim could mean life or death for millions. Now he's gone. As soon as the news is out, 5 million people flood towards Moscow. They come from across the Soviet Union. From farms and factories. From collective villages and industrial cities. They all want to see the remains of the man who, over a quarter of a century, decided whether they lived or died. The crowds are so massive that hundreds are crushed to death in the chaos. Bodies pile up in the streets. But still they come. Many people who hated Stalin said, "Thank God he snuffed it at last," one witness recalls. Many others saw him as a kind of demigod and were stunned to find out that he turned out to be mortal. But the third and the most important concern for everyone was, what happens now? What happens now? The whole world is reeling from the shock. While Molotov and others close to Stalin carry the coffin through Red Square, each of them is thinking about the future. Who will succeed him? Will there be a power struggle? Will the Soviet Union change? Will the Cold War end? In Moscow, just as in London and Washington, people hope that the end of the Soviet dictator will also mean an end to political tensions. Their hopes will soon be dashed. 8 years of continual latent conflict between the USA and the Soviet Union have shaped the world in such a way that there is no easy way to turn back. The Cold War has become institutionalized. NATO on one side, the Warsaw Pact on the other, nuclear weapons on both sides, proxy wars across the globe. Stalin and Truman's Cold War will dominate the world and chill the hearts of humanity for nearly 40 years. From Yalta to Stalin's death. From the shopkeeper's inheritance to the dictator's fall. From atomic monopoly to nuclear standoff. 8 years that shaped the world. The shopkeeper from Missouri faced down the dictator from Georgia. And though Stalin is gone, the world they created, divided, armed, afraid, will persist for decades. The terrible war Kennan warned about never came. But neither did peace. Instead, the world got something in between. A Cold War that would define a generation. And it all began here. In the palaces of Yalta. In the ruins of Berlin. In the confrontation between a shopkeeper and a dictator. The shopkeeper defeated the dictator. From a tie salesman in Missouri to the man who faced down Stalin, Harry Truman proved that in history's darkest moments, courage and principle can triumph over fear and tyranny. His grandson remembers. He was the kind of man who, when given a job, did it. Simple words, but they capture everything. Truman never sought the presidency. Never imagined he'd face down the most feared man on the planet. But when the job fell to him, he did it. No matter the cost. The Berlin airlift stands as his greatest triumph. For 11 months, American and British planes flew supplies into a city surrounded by Soviet forces. 6,000 tons a day. A plane landing every 30 seconds. Stalin predicted the West would give up. He was wrong. 2.5 million Berliners survived because Truman refused to back down. Because he understood that surrendering Berlin meant surrendering Europe. The Marshall Plan rebuilt a continent. $16 billion flowed across the Atlantic. Factories rose from rubble. Economies recovered. Democracy took root. Behind the facade of generosity was cold calculation. Prosperous democracies don't turn communist. Trading partners create interdependence. Economic power proved as effective as any army. And in 1949, Truman helped create NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an alliance of democracies pledging collective defense. An attack on one would be considered an attack on all. NATO still exists today. 75 years later, the alliance Truman built continues to deter aggression. Containment became the foundation of American Cold War policy. George Kennan's strategy, stand firm, don't appease, force Stalin to back down, worked for 40 years. Truman's character made the difference. His grandson's words echo. He expected people to be straightforward and honest. When he discovered they weren't, when he discovered Stalin wasn't, he very quickly got his back up and began to deal with Stalin more roughly, more directly, and more confrontationally. A shopkeeper's stubbornness became a political asset. Plain speaking meant clear communication. Missouri values became democratic principles. But the Cold War Truman helped create came at a terrible cost. 40 years of tension. Millions dead in proxy wars. Billions spent on weapons instead of development. Korea remains divided to this day. 70 years after the war began, families are still separated. The 38th parallel still cuts through the peninsula. 3 million died in a war that solved nothing. Vietnam would follow. Then Afghanistan. Then dozens of smaller conflicts across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Communist guerrillas fighting American-backed governments. Soviet advisors training revolutionary armies. Proxy wars that devastated entire nations. The nuclear arms race drained both superpowers. At its peak, there were 70,000 nuclear warheads on Earth. Enough to destroy human civilization many times over. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world came within 13 days of nuclear annihilation. President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev stared at each other across the abyss. One miscalculation would have ended everything. They pulled back from the brink. Barely. Generations grew up under the shadow of nuclear war. Children practiced hiding under desks. Families built fallout shelters. Everyone knew that at any moment the missiles could fly. The fear was real. The weapons were real. The danger was real. But World War III never came. That's the paradox of the Cold War. It was terrible. It cost millions of lives. It wasted countless resources. It divided the world for decades. But it prevented something worse. Direct war between the superpowers would have been nuclear. Nuclear war would have been apocalyptic. The entire Northern Hemisphere might have been destroyed. So, in a twisted way, the Cold War saved humanity by making war impossible. Raymond Aron's words proved prophetic. War is impossible. Peace is improbable. And for 40 years, the world lived in that impossible space between war and peace. The lessons echo today. Underestimated leaders can rise to greatness. Credentials don't determine capacity. Character matters more than resume. Truman proved that ordinary people can make extraordinary history when they have the courage to do what's right. Principle matters in the face of tyranny. Appeasement fails against dictators. Chamberlain proved this with Hitler. Truman learned the lesson. Firmness works when backed by strength and resolve. Stalin understood force. When the West stood firm, he backed down. When they showed weakness, he advanced. Economic power rivals military might. The Marshall Plan was as effective as any army. Prosperity defeats ideology. Trade creates interdependence. Money can be a weapon or a tool. Alliances, built on shared values, endure. NATO succeeded because democracies united voluntarily. The Warsaw Pact failed because it was coerced. Common principles create lasting bonds. And nuclear weapons changed everything. They made total war obsolete. They forced conflicts to remain limited. They created deterrence through terror. Those weapons still shape geopolitics today. But questions remain unanswered. Could cooperation have worked instead of confrontation? What if Roosevelt had lived? What if Yalta's promises had been kept? Was the conflict inevitable given the ideologies? Or did personalities make it worse? Stalin's paranoia predated Truman. The Soviet system required an external enemy to justify internal repression. Buffer states seemed non-negotiable to Stalin after 20 million Soviet deaths. Could the West have accepted spheres of influence? Could there have been peaceful coexistence from the start? We'll never know. History doesn't reveal its alternatives. What we do know is this: Truman left office unpopular. The Korean War dragged on. McCarthyism poisoned American politics. His approval ratings were abysmal. But his reputation rose after his death. Historians reassessed his presidency. The Marshall Plan looked better with hindsight. The Berlin airlift became legendary. Containment proved successful. Now he's seen as one of America's better presidents. Not great, perhaps, but good. Competent. Principled. A man who did the job when it fell to him. The world Truman and Stalin made still shapes our lives. Europe remained divided for 45 years. The Berlin Wall stood from 1961 to 1989. Families separated by concrete and barbed wire. Korea is still divided today. The war that began in 1950 never officially ended. An armistice, not a peace treaty. The wound never healed. But the institutions they created outlasted the Cold War. The United Nations, flawed but functioning. NATO, expanded and still relevant. The World Bank and IMF, economic architecture that shaped globalization. Today, we see echoes of their conflict. Russia and the West still clash. China and America compete for global influence. Nuclear weapons still threaten humanity. The Cold War ended, but its patterns persist. Two men shaped this history. Stalin, the paranoid dictator who tried to remake the world in his image. Who built an empire on fear and blood? Who died alone, abandoned by the system he created? And Truman, the plain-spoken Democrat who said no. Who stood firm when others urged appeasement? Who proved that democracy could defend itself? Neither would have chosen this confrontation. Both believed they were defending civilization. Both were right from their own perspective. Both were wrong about many things. But history remembers what they did, not what they intended. The shopkeeper's greatest achievement: he sold the American people on standing firm. He sold Europeans on the Marshall Plan. He sold allies on collective defense. He sold the world on the idea that democracy could survive. And he never sold himself as a hero, just a man doing the job that fell to him. The Cold War he helped create may have chilled the world, but it also prevented the inferno of World War III. Millions died in proxy wars, but billions survived who might not have. The nuclear threat terrified generations, but the weapons were never used again. And perhaps, in the end, that was the shopkeeper's greatest sale of all. From the palaces of Yalta to the ruins of Berlin, from Stalin's death to the fall of the Berlin Wall, from 1945 to 1989 and beyond, the Cold War shaped our world. And it began with a shopkeeper who refused to back down. From April 1945 to March 1953. 8 years, that defined 40 years. From Roosevelt's death to Stalin's death. From Yalta's promises to Berlin's triumph. From atomic monopoly to nuclear standoff. From wartime alliance to Cold War enmity. The personalities that made this history were flawed humans, not gods. Truman, the shopkeeper who became a statesman, who never wanted the job but did it anyway, who faced down the most feared man on earth with nothing but stubborn principle. Stalin, the revolutionary who became a tyrant, who built an empire on fear, who died alone, abandoned by those too terrified to help him. Churchill, the lion who saw the danger coming, who warned the world about the Iron Curtain, who lost power just as the war he predicted began. And Roosevelt, the idealist who died too soon, who believed he could work with Stalin, who never saw how completely Stalin would betray him, and millions of ordinary people caught between them. Berliners growing vegetables through tarmac, Korean families divided by ideology, soldiers dying in proxy wars they didn't understand. The decisions made in those 8 years echo today. NATO still defends Europe. The Marshall Plan became the model for foreign aid. Containment remained the blueprint for facing authoritarianism. The Berlin airlift proved that resolve can triumph without war. And Korea remains divided. The Cold War's unfinished business. We see the patterns repeating. Great power competition returns. Russia and the West still clash over spheres of influence. China and America compete for global dominance. Nuclear weapons still prevent direct war while enabling proxy conflicts. The lessons Truman learned remain relevant. Stand firm against aggression. Build coalitions of democracies. Use economic power strategically. Communicate clearly and directly. Never underestimate your opponent. Never back down from doing what's right. These were real people making impossible choices. Every decision carried the weight of millions of lives. Every mistake could have triggered World War III. They weren't perfect. They made errors. Some choices prevented disaster. Others caused suffering. But they acted with conviction. They believed they were building a better world. And in some ways, they succeeded. The shopkeeper versus the dictator. An unlikely matchup that changed history. Small-town merchant against feared revolutionary. Democratic values against communist ideology. Economic power against military force. In the end, democracy stood firm. Millions died in the proxy wars that followed. Generations lived in fear of nuclear annihilation. Resources were wasted that could have fed the hungry and housed the homeless. But World War III never came. The terrible war Kennan warned about remained impossible. The nuclear weapons that terrified the world also prevented their own use. And perhaps that's the final paradox. The Cold War was terrible, but the alternative would have been worse. Thank you for listening to History Radio. The shopkeeper defeated the dictator. But the Cold War they created defined a generation and shaped the world we live in today. This is the story of how it all began. In the palaces of Yalta, in the ruins of Berlin, in the confrontation between courage and tyranny. Subscribe for more stories of the people who shaped our world. Until next time.